And hello, subscribers and eavesdroppers. And welcome today to a discussion that I think you'll find pretty interesting. I'm going to be exploring with my guest a topic that I have to say keeps me up at night, one of the many. It concerns the anti-vilification and hate laws that are being embraced by a great many governments around the West, including Australia's governments. And these laws sound benign and progressive, but in my view, they're insidious and regressive. And arguably, they're facilitating rather than suppressing hateful speech. But my guest today will speak on all these matters far more eloquently than I can. It's Alan Davison. And Alan is the former Dean of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Technology, Sydney. He was that rare academic who is game to confront the tendencies on some of the left to try to suppress contentious debates on topics such as trans ideology and aspects of Islam. He'll be familiar, I imagine, to some of you as the co-host of the Permission to Speak series on Josh Seps's podcast, Uncomfortable Conversations. And most importantly, for present purposes, he's the president of something called the Free Speech Union, which you may not have heard of. It's the local chapter of a British organisation set up in 2019 to campaign on free speech, to defend people who have been sued or charged under anti-vilification laws and the like. This may be me one day if some of these laws pass through, especially a law that's currently being debated in the Victorian Parliament. So, Alan, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks for inviting me on your show.
And Alan, I think the first time that you came on my radar was about 2 years ago when you dared to participate in a debate, an actual kind of formal debate, I think, or a panel discussion it was, at Melbourne University, organised by the philosophy department. It was on aspects of transgender policies, say, and it was a pretty wild event. There were people who withdrew, including an ABC journalist, before it had even started. And afterwards, there was an incident involving masked trans activists that who harassed some of the participants at a restaurant. I guess my question on the basis of that incident is what's happened to universities, right? They used to be places where, you know, their mission was supposed to be places of intellectual debate where no ideas are sacrosanct. But you'd have to say that these days the university is the place least likely to be a site of intellectual contestation, right, and the robust exchange of ideas. Would you agree?
Yes, I think that's a sad but fair characterisation. But in some ways we should remind ourselves that universities actually used to be centres for the promulgation of dogma, particularly religious dogma, centuries ago. So some of my more cynical friends with a long historical view would say that universities are just reverting back to what they used to be. The idea that universities would be sort of areas of open inquiry, free and unfettered from censorship, of course that's reasonably modern, if you like, let's say through the 19th century into the 20th. Prior to that, the role of universities in many cases was the, dare one say it, the sort of indoctrination, the bookish indoctrination around religious texts and you know, the great religiously appropriate thinkers. And in a way we can think of universities have reverted to that, but obviously rather than old-fashioned religions, if you will, it's a whole lot of new orthodoxies. But it's still a fair point that coming off the base of universities being places, and remarkably, uniquely being places where open and free inquiry and debate is actually a part of their mission, is what they're funded to do, is what the public expectation is for them to do. The question is still a valid one. What has happened to them? How is it that they've got to this lamentable state? And I think there's probably several coinciding currents and pressures, but one of the most obvious ones is over the last few decades there's been an increasing sort of tribalism amongst a certain sort of progressive leftist cohort within many disciplines, particularly in the humanities, arts and social sciences, which are the fields that I'm most familiar with, where certainly research that's been done overseas in the States, looking at, Republican versus Democrat leanings, right versus left, conservative versus progressive, and then sort of revolutionary progressive or leftist. There's been a massive rise in the tribalism on the left and the progressive left within many academic cohorts. So in a way, what's happening in universities is a combination of a generational shift in the lack of viewpoint diversity, particularly political diversity and ideological diversity, I'd argue, combined with a whole lot of forces as well. I don't think any single trend in itself is enough to make universities what they are today, but there's several threads or currents that have coincided, and that's probably a fundamental one, and that is to find even someone moderately centrist in a university department of a certain type is almost unheard of. They'd be characterised as being right-wing anyway, even if they weren't. And so there's this sort of echo chamber of increased, if you like, extremism or on the fringes of leftist ideology that has become more and more refined and iterated over the years, so that the lack of diversity of perspectives within some discipline areas is terrifying, but we also see the consequence of it in that we simply don't see dissenting voices on what's become really embedded orthodoxies, I feel.
Your background is particularly fascinating. You have a PhD in musicology. I think you're a pianist. I saw in your bio that you were homeschooled for a period. Don't need to talk about that necessarily, but I'm interested in how that kind of background informs your thinking now. How did you go from musicology?
Hard to reflect because,
yeah.
So on the musicology thing, I got into university through a special pathway for basically talented performers. So yes, I was homeschooled. Didn't matriculate, didn't actually get my HSC or equivalent.
Really?
But got in through special consideration. By the time I went to university, I'd published a peer-reviewed paper in biology as a young teenager, because I did all kinds of interesting things through homeschooling, as many people do. But I was a reasonably talented pianist, so I was thankful to have a very fine teacher who suggested I auditioned and got in that way. So there's that. But I think where the homeschooling came into play with my heterodoxy now and since then is being motivated to learn and question things myself. And it doesn't mean to say I have a disregard for authority and for wisdom and all the rest of it, but it does mean I was used to just studying up on things myself, becoming very critically minded. I was reading, texts by Karl Popper and other philosophers, particularly the sort of the atheist type philosophers, but others as well as a teenager. So I immersed myself in things like history and philosophy of science, epistemology, philosophy, things like that. So I developed those sort of critical faculties, I believe, reasonably early. And then it was a bit of a shock going to university because I found that many of my fellow students were actually less critical and open-minded than I was. But what they were prepared to do is jump on various bandwagons attached to critical theory. So even though this was some time ago, gender theory, theories around race, theories around systemic racism, which was all very dominant in the universities even 20 plus years ago. So I've been aware of the state of universities and these threads for some time, but I, like other sort of sceptical or heretical people within the university culture at the time, so we're talking 1990s into the early 2000s, most of us, I think, had the naive view that a lot of what gets talked about at university scholarly conferences, particularly in arts, social sciences, which is dominated a lot by, let's call it critical theory or postmodernism. A lot of that stuff was just echo chambers. It was people talking to like-minded people about things that most people didn't care about, which is typical of academia, that's me, rightly or wrongly. What I think has taken many of us by surprise is that in the last 5, maybe 10 years, but certainly in the last 5 years, many of these ideas which are intellectually bereft of rigour have become now mainstream, particularly around gender, particularly around race, what we might call now identity politics, things like that. Those things were being discussed within academic forums 20, 30 years ago, but were sort of, I think, quite isolated from the real world. And I think all those people have grown up and got jobs in government, public service and other jobs in universities. So it is now the norm that ideas of rigorous critical thinking, demands for standards of evidence, demands and expectations about the nature of intellectual debate and dispute, they're basically absent, and there's just the vacuous shell of those around universities now that are trying to maintain a reputation of being places of deep inquiry, but in my view many of them aren't.
And in terms of why, I guess, why has that happened? I mean, I'm just wondering, I'm just thinking aloud here, but do you think maybe the changing nature of employment at a university has a bit to do with it? That universities are more and more relying on casual staff, short-term contracts, people who perhaps feel vulnerable in their positions and feel that they better toe the line academically or not stand out too much, lest they get squeezed out?
Why is a fascinating question. And again, I think there's several currents here. One of which is, I think, undoubtedly the massification of education globally, certainly in the English-speaking world. And Australia, you could say, has benefited as much as any other country from the massification of education. But you have to ask, are there certain key elements of what a university should be about? Because the university experience at times should be an uncomfortable experience. You should have your worldviews challenged, no matter what they are, no matter where they've come from. You should be able to articulate your right to make claims about the world and other people, not just because of some protected identity characteristic you think you have, but because there's logic, evidence, reason and argument behind it. Now, I think massification has had an impact because it means that, in a way, universities have to turn what used to be critical thinking and deep rigorous engagement into something that can be easily digested and put through the sausage factories of universities. Whilst at the same time, while meeting the needs of students being safe spaces and all the rest of it, while at the same time, there's no doubt that there are many academics within certain disciplines at universities that are almost openly happy for them to be re-education camps. That is, the role of many academic colleagues that I know, not necessarily friends, but people that I know, they very much see their role as an academic is to make students woke. And by that I mean properly in the term woke, not derogatory. That is, make them awake to systemic racism, systemic bias, all those kinds of things. So it is their job, and is in fact their duty, to educate students to the various evils of Western liberal democracy or whatever it happens to be, and to uncover all the dark things that are happening in Western society. And they think that is actually their job, and if they succeed in doing that and get a cohort of students going out and marching down the streets for Black Lives Matter or for trans rights, they see that as a success. So again, for those of us who are sceptical or concerned about that attitude, it hasn't just happened by accident. There are many people within academia who are perfectly comfortable with that, and they are also perfectly comfortable without a counter voice being present. So they genuinely believe that is their role, and that is the role of an institution. It is not a place to challenge ideas. It's a place to challenge certain types of ideas and beliefs of a certain type of person from a certain type of background, and to make them, if you will, woke. And so I think it is a problem. And if you combine those two major threads together, with a whole lot of other things like managerialism, sort of the evils of a neoliberal approach to universities being, businesses with students as customers, and the sort of rhetoric around social justice, which, comes loudest from universities with vice-chancellors on $1 million plus salaries and all of their cohorts. So, all of these things come together, but fundamentally, the degradation of intellectual inquiry and the commitment to that at universities, I think has been exercised or activated quite willingly by a large percentage of academics who are quite happy for universities to have that role, and they see it actually as their role.
Okay, that's sobering. I suppose that's obvious from just observing the way things are playing out. It's pretty scary. I wonder also social media. You see academics consciously branding themselves on social media. As we know, it's a pretty crude place. It's not really a place for nuanced argument. I just wonder how much that kind of dynamic, the dynamic of social media, has in fact filtered back into the academy, or seeped back into the academy, and whether that's making everything just more crude.
Look, it's certainly like the backdrop, isn't it, social media, but I think aside from academics they have a profile on social media and they signal who they are, I suppose it's the flip side of that is how the fear of social media mobbing can be weaponised.
Yeah.
So it's not just it can be used to promote people that are think they're on the right side of history. I think more concerning is the fact how it can be weaponised en masse and quickly against academics or indeed anybody who stands up against certain types of orthodoxies. So I think that is definitely a key dynamic in what how some academics choose to engage or not engage in contentious issues, that they know that social media is not far behind, even if they're not on it themselves. Social media can be activated very quickly. Now, of course, many people would say that's a positive. There's been very many good things that have come from, the rapid utilisation of social media for various purposes. But of course, social media itself can be topic neutral and ethically neutral. It can be weaponised in any direction for any purpose effectively. So I think that is a dynamic within which academics have to function, even if they're not deeply engaged with social media themselves.
Okay, so speaking of social media, and moving now to your position as president of the Free Speech Union, I wanted to talk about a particular fascinating, recent, grossly underreported case involving Australia's the Commonwealth Office of the eSafety Commissioner. A case that I know that you're across and that the Free Speech Union was involved in. But before we get to that, perhaps do you want to talk a bit about the Free Speech Union, what it is, and how you got involved?
Sure. So Free Speech Union started globally in the UK under Toby Young, one of the prime movers there. So it's probably the best known Free Speech Union. Been going now for, I think, 5 years, just had their 5-year anniversary, and achieved wonderful things. Not only many thousands of members, but high visibility cases and wins defending people that have been, say, gender critical or even expressed, say, a religious right to do something or an opinion, and they've been cancelled, mobbed, lost their job at an institution. So Free Speech Union in the UK is doing terrific work. After the Free Speech Union UK, other free speech unions have cropped up, more or less, I'd say, organically, but in concert with. And there's Free Speech Union. We've got very active Free Speech Union colleagues over in New Zealand, so I'd invite listeners and viewers to check out Free Speech Union New Zealand. They've been doing terrific work. And likewise in Australia, we're newer. So Free Speech Union's only been around a little bit over a year, and it was set up by Reuben Kirkham down in Melbourne and Dara McDonald up in Sydney as the two co-directors. And I came on relatively late, so I've just been appointed as of December last year. So just a couple of months in and finding my feet, but absolutely thrilled to be doing the work. And really the Free Speech Union in Australia is intending to do, and has been doing indeed, as you mentioned that case, really advocating where we see egregious or very, very problematic cases of speech being suppressed, whether it's a tweet being geo-blocked or someone being punished for a particular view, in their workplace, or etc. And our role is really not only to support individual cases, of course, when they come along, and where we can, we need to fundraise. Obviously, legal costs can be important and all the rest of it. So becoming a mechanism in that whole process of defending individuals or individual cases. But my job as president particularly is really to raise awareness in the Australian context of how fragile free speech can be, and the importance of having concerns and interest and support for free speech generally as a principle much more highly raised in the consciousness, if you like, of the country generally. So really, I think Australians haven't worried much about free speech in the past, or at least not in, let's say, in recent times. And that means we tend to be a little bit blasé about encroachments upon free speech. And part of my role of president, aside from building up membership interest and promoting the cause of free speech, is to really raise awareness of the kinds of almost ceaseless encroachments upon free speech that, even if we end up as a society or a government brings in a hate speech rule or something, at least we have a fulsome and rigorous conversations about potential perverse outcomes of any piece of legislation or law, or even a locally applied policy in an institution or organisation. And it's really just making sure that rather than jumping on hate speech legislation and just being positive, because nobody wants hate, we're just aware of the implications that might be more medium or long term about how free speech can be eroded through those kinds of legal tools.
So, coming back to this case involving the Office of the eSafety Commissioner. Now, the eSafety Commission has been in the news recently. The Commissioner, Julie Imnan, had a very high-profile rumble, I think several, with Elon Musk. Most recently, she wanted the video of the stabbing of the Assyrian bishop in Sydney taken down. That made global headlines. But it turns out, and whatever you may think about that, it turns out that in fact that office and some of the bureaucrats within that office appear to have been running a kind of off-the-books or off-leash censorship regime that the rest of us didn't really know about. And I suppose this really illustrates some of the dangers with letting bureaucrats, in a sense, decide what is and what isn't acceptable speech. Do you want to take us through this case where the office recently got quite a reprimand from the Commonwealth Tribunal? It's a case involving Celine against the machine. That's her moniker. Do you want to talk about it?
Yes, and look, it'd be good to talk about this as a case that raises a whole lot of other potential concerns, which you've already alluded to. So, Celine against the machine, that's her social media handle, is part of, I think she's part of an advocacy group called Gays Against Groomers. And she posted on X, it's hard to get used to saying X, by the way, I always want to say Twitter still, it's stuck at my age anyway, about a Melbourne primary school that had set up a queer club. This is a primary school. And she posted something on that. I think it's now back up, by the way, so your listeners can probably go and find it. What happened was the eSafety Commissioner's team put through an informal takedown order, basically, but the complexity of it is the tweet got taken down because X received the order, what they perceived to be an order from the eSafety Commissioner, but in actual fact it was only an informal takedown order. And that, as it transpires after this, after the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and all the other things that we've gone through, that seems to be the typical modus operandi of the eSafety Commissioner's team, sending out informal notice. Now, the trouble with informal takedown notices is that there's a lack of transparency about who precisely is complaining, what precisely is the harm, what precisely is the legal breach in terms of any legal definition of hate, harm, whatever. Basically, so it's all done under the radar, and yet it's their major way of doing things, their main way of doing things.
So just in this particular case, Celine against the machine, as she calls herself, posted a tweet just critical of the fact that a primary school was hosting a queer club.
Yep.
Yeah, years 3 to 6 or something like that, right? The tweet itself seemed quite mild to me.
Yeah, and look,
some people would want to know.
Some people might find it snarky, but snarky is not the grounds for a takedown.
No.
And there's lots of snarky people, on the progressive side who are revel in being snarky and calling everyone a Nazi. So I think what really emerged from the case, which the Free Speech in Fundraise for, and my colleague Rugam Kirkham was instrumental in defending and raising awareness, is that there's complete overreach of something which did not actually meet the threshold of having to be taken down, even with the current laws that we had. There's an informal mechanism which lacks transparency and, of course, lacks accountability, because Celine didn't know who made the complaint on what grounds. And so, therefore, who knows how many other hundreds, if not thousands, of tweets have been taken down. Lack of transparency, lack of accountability. And I think it speaks to two things. On the one hand, there's the nature of whatever laws that the eSafety Commissioner should be working under, and we should have a fulsome debate about, are those online safety, hate speech, or the things that basically guide legally in a very technical way decisions that the eSafety Commissioner and her team might need to make. There's that, and that's one discussion. And then there's the actual, what happens in practice? And this is an example of what happens in practice. And this case didn't even meet the threshold that they were required to meet, and yet they've found, the eSafety Commissioner and her team's found a very effective way of basically suppressing and deleting effectively a whole lot of expression that doesn't even meet the threshold for the application of those laws, if you like. So, and that's on a significant scale. So what's worrying there, and I think this is a great example of unforeseen implications. When a law is brought in regarding hate speech, online hate, anti-vilification, all that kind of stuff, we need to make sure we have a good conversation about that, where the boundaries are, clarity of definitions. But this wasn't a case about the lack of a definition, it was a bit fuzzy. This was, we would argue, a case of complete overreach of the Safety Commissioner and her team, such that they were really going to town, and one can only assume there's massive incentives for her team to meet KPIs. They can turn around to their government masters and say, look, we had all these hateful things taken down offline, and that's no doubt a KPI that they can boast about meeting. The problem is, where's the transparency and accountability around that? And the case of Celine against the machine is, I think, really illustrative of the concern that many of us have that even if the laws are through, and whether people are happy with them or not, that's one thing, but it's keeping the government bodies, who are the ones that actually have to, if you like, execute and enact these laws, making sure there's absolute transparency and accountability for them justifying their decisions. And this is a case that I think raises serious concerns about that whole domain of hate speech online, when you've really got to argue if that what Celine posted could even vaguely constitute the kinds of threshold that really should be relevant here.
There was already a lot of controversy around the eSafety Commissioner and her actions that arguably enforced certain ideological positions that were contested on gender identity ideology, whether males can breastfeed and that sort of thing. But it's extraordinary that something like an informal takedown notice exists. That they would essentially invent something like that. And when it got to the tribunal, right, there was a pretty strong decision there saying, well, no, you can't operate a regime like this, and these informal takedown notices can be subject to review, judicial review, like any other.
Yeah, and you mentioned something earlier on, Julia, which I think is relevant at the top of this part of our conversation, is the lack of coverage. Now, I've spoken to quite a few colleagues who are good news watchers, like they listen to morning news, they watch ABC or afternoon evening news, and they're sort of switched on. They don't live in a cave. They'd heard nothing about this. I know there has been some coverage. I'm presuming in the Murdoch press. There's been something, I think, a bit of something on Sky News, etc. There's even been coverage overseas. I believe it's the Wall Street Journal covered it. And yet, this in many ways is a landmark case. It clearly demonstrates the potential for overreach and lack of accountability on precisely the things we should be concerned about. And I've seen or heard barely a pip out of many of our mainstream, and certainly not the progressive media, who I think are trying to present the eSafety Commissioner in a very particular light as being a champion against hate and towards and all those kinds of things, which wouldn't want to doubt sincerity for a moment. But this isn't an issue of sincerity. This is an issue of, I would have thought that a significant case like this with very significant ramifications for online free speech and the application of laws or their misapplication, I would have thought this would have been a story of national significance that should have garnered interviews on evening news, current affairs shows and all the rest of it. And there's been surprisingly little, I think it's fair to say, and it does raise questions about the muteness, if not conspiracy, if you will, of a whole lot of mainstream and progressive media being quite happy for this kind of thing to happen, or they really don't like the counter-narrative or the cognitive dissonance of seeing this kind of thing happens. But it does raise the question, where is the scrutiny and the accountability to these kinds of government agencies, instruments and leaders of those agencies and their application of the law? Where is the scrutiny we're seeing in mainstream debate as opposed to, if you like, more conservative media, which I know have been covering it? But a lot of people don't watch conservative media, and they don't have to, of course. I wouldn't criticise them for that. But if you're relying on...
Nor did they cover it extensively.
And of course we can...
the Murdoch media.
Very clear parallel to this in the almost complete lack of coverage of the controversies over gender medicine, particularly from the ABC, which I know was called out by Paul Barry in Media Watch as practically one lone voice. And that was happening even whilst the CAS review into the Tavistock Clinic and gender care in the UK was going on, with interim findings that were of worldwide significance, indicating the concerns around the robustness of evidence being used to take certain steps and protocols with, if you like, gender medicine. And it's staggering that stories which are now emerging as national stories of concern, in this country, it's like we're 2 or 3 years behind the rest of the world. And all I hear from our ABC, I'm sorry to say, and some other media outlets is, it's not relevant to Australia. Now, issues like free speech, hate speech laws, online regulation, gender medicine could be, immigration policies, rates of violence amongst certain communities, all of these things are relevant globally because they're patterns that repeat globally. So the idea that there's something going on somewhere else in the world, particularly if it's in a Western democratic country like ourselves, excuse me, is somehow not relevant to the Australian context, I find utterly bizarre, because they'll jump on the rise of the right wing and the rise of fascism in some part of Europe, and they'll say it has important ramifications for Australia. So there's a sort of asymmetry with reporting in that who decides if something that's happening globally is relevant to Australia? Because it only seems to be one side of the spectrum where it's of any interest. And this doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be concerned about the rise of far-right parties. Not saying that at all. All I'm saying is how much coverage in Australia was there of the Antifa riots and violence, and indeed murders by Antifa members in the US over months. Attacks on government facilities, attacks on government staff, actual murder, and that was all from extreme left-wing activist groups, and all I heard was Black Lives Matter and people marching down the street. If you mentioned the role of Antifa, there was deafening silence. So again, these things are very frustrating, because who has decided that it's for the benefit of the average news consumer whether something should or should not be covered, or whether we're told it is or isn't of interest to you? And I think some of our mainstream media outlets have a lot to answer for.
Absolutely, and in the case of gender medicine, there's just so much that even after years of being immersed in this area, I just don't understand. I just don't understand the psychology. I particularly don't understand the psychology of our elected leaders, officials, health officials, and so on.
Well, and it's symptomatic of what's happened in the university itself in that, and this has a lot to do with something which isn't really related to free speech, but free speech is a critical enabler of solving it. And that is, I think there's an over-reliance nowadays on people presenting themselves to others as good people on the right side of history through the beliefs that they publicly ascribe to. So we know that if you have certain hashtags on your profile, if you wear certain badges on your lanyard or your work thing, they're often clustered around things which logically are quite disconnected from each other. But they're all indicative now of you are a good, progressive, open-minded person and you ascribe to these things. And that we need to ask, why is there the need to do that? Why is there the need for people to present themselves to others, whether it's through social media, through their online interactions or in the workplace or elsewhere, to sort of publicly indicate, I am a good person because I ascribe to these views or positions? Whereas, for instance, people wearing badges relating to supporting transgender and, trans women and women, those kinds of hashtags and things like that, would any of them have read the Cass review? Would any of them have read the serious concerns about the mental state, vulnerability, psychological comorbidities of young teens and adolescents who have gender dysphoria, with often a host of other psychological conditions as well? Do they have even the slightest familiarity with the concerns that legitimate scholars, practitioners, medical experts, psychologists, of course they wouldn't. They just know that saying you're in favour of someone who's been born in the wrong body being affirmed into the right body, that makes you a good person. So therefore, anyone raising concerns around actually the evidence for that is highly dubious and emerging as increasingly so. But what happens if you put up your hand and say, I have concerns around the almost complete orthodoxy around the affirmation model within the Australian context nowadays? You'll get howled down as a transphobe and a bad person. So because we're in an era where ascribing to these so-called progressive and positive things is so important for one's position within society, for one's identity, that we're not able to decouple your own sense of worth, your own ethical considerations, your own actions as a moral agent, from a whole lot of off-the-shelf beliefs that you're told you need to ascribe to. And I think social media has made that much worse, but unfortunately so have our institutions like universities, who also hammer on about that. And we saw a lot of the coverage could be on the transgender issue, could be on matters of immigration, it could be on matters of the racial relations within Australia, it doesn't matter what it is. So often people who raise concerns about that are framed as, well, you must be a bad person, or you are associated with a bad person because you appeared on Sky News to talk about it, and because you appeared on Sky News to talk about it, you must be a bad person. So the sort of naivety and lack of critical thinking about that is exactly what I see in universities themselves, because there is this deep moral identity judgment about people that basically dismisses the validity and the evidence behind their views or the strength of their arguments. And that comes at its heart from universities and the kind of ideological capture that our universities, in some disciplines certainly, have been suffering from now for many years. It's just very disappointing to see it out in the mainstream.
And like you say, this kind of moral thinking is often very selectively applied, right? So we're in the midst of, I think you'd agree, a kind of serious crisis of anti-Semitism in this country. And the complaint that I hear a lot in my community, in the Jewish community, is that well, we're not allowed to define ourselves. We're not allowed to define what is hate speech when every other kind of minority group is allowed to be the authority on what constitutes hate speech from their point of view. And as far as we see it, there is suddenly a very liberal attitude towards the sort of things you can say about Jews, as long as you call them Zionists, as opposed to the things that you can say about other groups. And we've seen things that I never thought that I would see in this country, people marching down the street with a placard saying, let's cleanse the world of Israel, basically, but represented by a Star of David, which is a symbol of all Jews. All Zionists are terrorists, that being kind of those sort of chants being heard very regularly in our cities. Now, the Jewish community leaders are very supportive of anti-vilification legislation for this reason, of hate speech. I think that they're wrong. But what do you say about that? What would you say specifically to the Jewish community that says, well, we need stronger laws because we're just the victims?
It's an excellent question. And firstly, I completely understand, but I can't imagine, but I understand, that for members of the Australian Jewish community, seeing people march down the street with genocidal implication slogans and chants, not always in English, of course, deeply disturbing and would be seen as manifestations of an existential threat. I get that. Where I would say urge caution and reflection on the obvious, if you like, response is let's strengthen hate speech or anti-vilification laws or so on and so forth. I think a few things need to be thought through there. Firstly, let's talk about there's sort of normative and empirical. So by normative, I mean there's the ideal of what we'd like to see. And then there's a whole lot of empirical questions to ask, which are the real world questions. How have we got to the point where dozens, maybe hundreds of people, and of course there was the infamous Sydney Opera House demonstration just a couple of days after October 7, and in a way it doesn't matter exactly what those young men were chanting, the implication was the same. And that didn't have much to do with Israel, that was about Jews and about finding Jews. And it was sort of dismissed as, as usual, the local Muslim leaders dismissed as that was just some young men getting too excited. No, that was young men saying the quiet bit out loud, as is often the case. So, but let's backtrack a bit. The first question to ask prior to the application of any laws is, this is all stuff that's come downstream of something. So it's not like the people chanting those things with deep anti-Semitic viewpoints. It's not like they only think that because we didn't have stronger hate speech laws. They think that for a whole lot of reasons that are cultural, religious, political, particularly in certain strains, more virulent strains of Islamism. That is entirely consistent, now perhaps not with the majority, but it's entirely consistent with certain rabid strains of Islamism, of which we have represented in this country, which you can hear occasionally in mosques, and which flares up every so often. We've certainly had it in mosques here in Western Sydney. The question is not, if we had better hate speech laws, we might stop them trying to say that, maybe in public, maybe chanting it. The fundamental question, which is upstream of all of this, is how and why are there people in this country, in Australia in the 21st century, in a liberal democracy, that adhere to a series of views that are completely antagonistic to our liberal modern democracy and in fact deeply cancerous to it. Now, the irony of hate speech laws is we know why we can't talk about that. We can't talk about that because we'll get labelled as being Islamophobic, which has been one of the most successfully weaponised tools from Islamic activists overseas, particularly in the UK, and it's found its way here. The slur of being called Islamophobic has been so successful and total that it has basically closed down any debate and research within academia and elsewhere about certain not insignificant toxic strains of Islamism in this country and elsewhere. So that is not a hate speech issue, That is an issue of not being able to talk openly and frankly about the cancerous and toxic beliefs of certain, even minority, members of certain communities that have no place in Australia in the 21st century. Now, hate speech laws will make that conversation even harder to have, because you've noticed, as you've written on yourself, Julie, very eloquently, whenever a politician mentions anti-Semitism, they also have to throw in the Islamophobia, like it's another side of a coin or something. Well, it's not, for a variety of reasons. But
why do you think they're doing that?
Well, that's just I would assume, trying to protect their good relationship with a vast array of multicultural stakeholders, and that they find the need to say, oh, we're against all hate and racism and bigotry, and we need to keep reminding everyone of that. But as you said, anti-Semitism can have a full stop. You don't need to constantly reference cases of Islam. And of course there is, if you want to call it Islamophobia, I'd call it anti-Muslim sentiment or bigotry. The problem with Islamophobia, of course, is that Islam is many things, including a religion, a set of religious beliefs. It is absurd that you cannot reasonably criticise a series of religious beliefs. And there are a whole lot of religious beliefs held by certain strains of Islam that are absolutely subject to legitimate criticism in a Western open democracy. Of course they are. So coming back to why politicians say that, I think it's always to placate that, yes, they're trying to acknowledge, weakly or not, the virulent anti-Semitism that's out there. They're trying to cover the fact that anti-Semitism generally is coming from one of two areas. And they're also being vague about anti-Semitism as somehow this sort of amorphous thing in the atmosphere. It's all part of a hate that we have to deal with. And another example of hate is Islamophobia, and another example of hate is transphobia. It's like there's these compounds floating around in the air that we breathe, made up of hate, and it manifests. That's not the case. It's people that have beliefs that lead to hatred. They are hatred beliefs in themselves. And in some communities and societies, they are deeply embedded into their social, political and religious ecosystems. And that speaks to certain minorities, but that virulent strains of Islamism. And we should be able to talk about that openly and frankly, and I'm sure there'd be many, many moderate Muslims who would agree with the conversation we're having now, but of course many of them won't speak out for obvious reasons. And part of the lack of honesty relates to two things. Firstly, people are afraid of being called racist in general. I get that. And we don't want to offend members of a very rich and largely very successful multicultural society that we have in Australia. Absolutely good. That's absolutely fine. But we shouldn't pretend that the fear of speaking out against certain strains of Islamism is not related to the actual physical fear of harm. And there was an utter cowardice to even speak. I mean, what happened to Salman Rushdie and a multitude of other people has everything to do with Islam and certain strains of Islamic beliefs, nothing to do with other particular religious beliefs. And the idea that there's a reluctance, we're going to say or pretend to ourselves that the reluctance to speak out against certain strains of Islamism, particularly the more violent and virulently anti-Semitic strains of it, is simply because we don't want to characterise ourselves as being racist or breaking the fabric of multicultural society. Whereas in actual fact, everybody knows as a reality there is a real and present physical threat to your life or the well-being of you and your family should you openly criticise Islam. And that is the case. I know many ex-Muslims who basically have to travel around incognito, can only attend events with security or with last-minute arrangements of where they speak and talk. You don't get that with Catholics. You don't even get that with ex-JWs. And the fear is actual physical violence to them or their family. And that is almost unique to certain strains of Islam. And there is no doubt that that fuels a lot of the fear of speaking out against certain strains of Islam. So I find it's an understandable cowardice and an understandable concern, but that is simply a reality of what happens if anybody in prominent public life takes a stand raising concerns about violence within Islamic communities, about the views of Islamic communities, certain Islamic communities towards homosexuality, the views in Islamic communities, and certainly men, towards the role of women, all of those things need to be talked about as part of discussing the social, multicultural fabric of this country, and they are legitimate things to talk about. Now, if most people are too scared to talk about it, the end result, there'll be the fringe people on the right who you don't want to hear talk about anything, they'll talk about it. And we know who those kinds of people are. And the thing is, they might even be right. The problem is it's not useful they're talking about it because they've disgraced themselves, and often they are genuinely racist people. So this is precisely the space and the sort of domains of discourse in our public life that universities, university researchers and public intellectuals need to be talking about. And it's clear that universities aren't up to the job. It's clear that politicians aren't up to the job for obvious reasons, and particularly those who rely on votes in Western Sydney. I imagine they're especially not up to the job. And our media is not up to the job because they've got a lack of nuance and ability and critical thinking to be able to talk about these issues in a way that of course doesn't and shouldn't demonise whole communities, because there's not whole communities we're talking about here, because they're actually very varied communities with lots of minority groups and disenfranchised within those communities. So the failure is almost at every level, but I understand why, because you don't have to go far to find tangible threats and the execution of threats against people that have spoken about these issues in the public domain.
And so, absolutely. And so, getting back to the anti-vilification or the hate speech legislation, I mean, there's been some new hate speech laws passed by the federal government. There's been some passed by the New South Wales government, and Victoria's, which, surprise, surprise, are the most potentially far-reaching, are now being debated in the Victorian government. But I think what you're saying is that, and I agree, that it's this idea of Islamophobia, which has become a kind of concept that's been enshrined in anti-racism discourse, even though even the word itself is a kind of gaslighting word.
Yeah.
That this will be that this kind of legislation will make it even harder, right, to discuss these kind of issues.
Yeah. So yes, I went on a long ramble there, but basically, your point is precisely right. That yes, it may well be a temporary, short fix band-aid to stop the most egregious examples of hate speech in the form of anti-Semitism at a march or displaying of a flag. Yes, it may do that. Firstly, it doesn't stop people still thinking and wanting to do those things. So at least, we see who they are, we see how many there are, and that's not a bad thing. But worse than that, it will be weaponised by the very people who hold those toxic and genocidal beliefs to defend themselves against scrutiny and criticism. Because hate speech laws cannot be made other than at very crude levels. And so in putting through hate speech laws that stop that kind of protest and manifestation of anti-Semitism, we will find it will actually be used against legitimate criticism of the very people holding those beliefs, which is an upstream issue. And in order to be able to talk about the upstream cultural issue, which is a difficult one, for sure, difficult one, in order to have that conversation, though, hate speech laws will make it practically impossible. Because in talking about well-evidenced and factual issues of attitude beliefs within Muslim males, for example, towards polygamy, towards the role of women in society, towards gays, non-binary people, etc. Can we please have a conversation about what the actual evidence is through survey work of male Muslim beliefs on those things? And I think the vast majority of Australia would be absolutely shocked to know the prevalence of those viewpoints. That is not Islamophobia. That is talking about actual factual evidence of a pervasiveness of viewpoints which are simply incompatible with a society that promotes gender equality, that promotes the idea that you can associate with and marry whomever you wish to. It is completely against all of those things, and yet we cannot have a conversation about basic matters of fact, such as that. The views towards, particularly Islamic men, because there's a sharp difference between views amongst men and women on these issues, regarding the application of Sharia law, whether it's done on matters that are private and personal, or whether it's more generally applied. Again, huge difference. So we need to be able to talk about, particularly in Muslim communities, prevalent attitudes from Muslim males towards things like women, law, rights, gender equality and things like that. Because in any other community, and particularly in, if you like, mainstream Australian community, if there was a survey done that found that 30% of men believe X, Y, and Z, 30% of Australian males would like to have multiple wives, there'd be outrage. Or that, 20-something% of men believe that they should be able to tell their wife what to do, and everyone would be outraged. But because it belongs to a particular community and because the term Islamophobia has been so successfully weaponised, there is zero debate on these things, which are actually well established as empirical facts. So it's already bad enough with the hate speech laws as such as they have been. It will only get worse if the very conversation and the facts and figures I've just mentioned can be characterised as me being Islamophobic. And yet these are the upstream issues that lead to a whole lot of downstream disunity in our community being the Australian community writ large. So unless we can have a conversation about in what way, simply because you belong to a particular cultural or religious community, is it okay for you to hold a whole lot of views that are simply not compatible with an open, free, democratic society of Australia? We need to be able to have that conversation. Because otherwise, when it comes downstream after there's been generations of that or that's been festering, hate speech laws will simply clamp down on any ability to even have that conversation. And it will actually make things worse. So the way that I'd urge community leaders, Jewish community leaders, is, excuse me, just think carefully that, yes, I think it's, particularly I can appreciate the distress that must be caused by this and the almost desperate urge to find a way of stopping it to happen. But I would urge caution because this is simply the manifestation of something that is already hard enough to talk about, and that anti-vilification, hate speech laws, so on and so forth, will make it even harder to talk about. So it will actually embed a whole lot of this societal disunity at a level that will not allow it to be scrutinised. And I think long term, it's a very bad move.
Yeah, look, I would even go further than that, and I would say that this idea that it would at least help the downstream effects, that you could put the Band-Aid and stamp out, the people saying F the Jews in front of the Opera House. I disagree. I mean, it's sort of the height of naivety to think that we've got a range of laws on the books already. The police have got broad powers to move people on, to intervene in various contexts. Laws about disrupting places of worship, for instance, and we've seen protests outside synagogues and so on. The idea that somehow these existing laws aren't being enforced, or at least there is a strong argument that they're not being enforced to the full extent that they could be. The idea that if you then have a whole new set of complex laws on the books, that would be the silver bullet and then you would get results, it's just the height of naivety in my view.
Yeah. And I think you're quite right, because the question to ask is, what is already in place law-wise that could have been applied in many of these circumstances? Asking the question, why weren't they applied? It's a fair question. And then further asking the question, if we had even more of them, would they be applied even more? And I think, again, another conversation to have, which is a very difficult one to have, often because of the slur of Islamophobia, is it the case that some of our politicians government agencies, etc., value harmonious, if not harmonious, at least a truce-like state with certain community leaders, because it's better to be in a good state of dialogue with community leaders, so-called community leaders anyway, and that's important. And in order to keep the good faith with those community leaders, they're perhaps making decisions about how not to intervene when there's egregious examples of anti-Semitism, because that might that basically might inflame or problematise their relationship with community leaders. But I can imagine what's left to see is that members of our Jewish community, and of course other people concerned, see displays like the one at the Opera House. I think it was October 9, wasn't it?
Yep, that's right.
And they ask themselves, how has that been okay? And it's sort of just been dismissed and passed away as, you know, as a few young men getting a bit too enthusiastic. And you think, actually, no, I wonder how many other young men from those communities would actually agree with and be shouting exactly that at night in their own homes. And are we even allowed to ask? Or is it more important that we maintain the tenuous fabric of a supposed relationship around community cohesion with the community leaders? And I think that's and I understand it's a very difficult place to go, but it's a fair question to ask, because I'm not sure what other community would have been indulged with such a display of hatred with so little ramifications. And it seems to me the only ramifications that came out is when there were actual real and present threats to well-being and safety, which led to the arrests of multiple Muslim teenagers, with concerns around threats of actual knife attacks and killings. Obviously that was a line too far. But again, what it indicates is that we're in an environment where we can't even talk about the broader underlying concerns that manifest themselves in these terrible occasions. It's not like they've come from nowhere. And one has to wonder how prevalent, how widespread, and how common are these views and attitudes within certain parts of our communities that most Australians don't get to see until it's the occasional protest. And they are fair questions. Now, how agencies get to deal with those problems, of course, they'll have their own views on how that could be dealt with. And I wouldn't want to, for a moment, second guess the decision that's being made by senior leaders in law enforcement and others about how they feel is best dealt with. But what I think we can do is ask a question about why aren't we having a broader conversation amongst our political classes that is not racist, it's not anti-Muslim, but it's asking a fair series of questions about the importance of social cohesion. Now, of course, we can't have that conversation because the characterisation of Western liberal democracy as being so inherently evil, and that anyone that is in a minority and isn't white has special privileged powers to be victims and have their point of view heard. Again, you can think that if you want, but there's still going to be actual ramifications for real-world democratic society that we need to live in. And again, that's where free speech and defending the idea of free speech, open inquiry, constructive dialogue is absolutely so critical, because these are not insignificant matters for the future of our country. And yet we don't seem to be having these discussions. And the lack of robustness around free speech and the fear that many people have in even wanting to speak out or engage in these conversations is so crippling. I don't see that we're going to have it anytime soon.
I agree, and these laws are only going to get an already difficult dynamic that's not working for us and make it worse. My last question is, I was just wondering your response to some quite startling comments, at least to some people's ears, recently from J.D. Vance, the Vice President, US Vice President, when he said that he thinks that censorship and the suppression of free speech in Western democracies is the biggest threat facing the West today. I'm not sure that I would agree with that, but he said that this could lead to very serious upheaval in our societies. Was he on to something? When you look at what's happening recently, what's happened in places like the UK, where we've seen riots by some of those, like you say, very, very dangerous and toxic people on the far right, but brought about by these fraught underlying issues to do with race, to do with the suppression of certain topics such as Islamism in our society and so on. What do you think?
Look, I think he's on to something. I mean, in a way, what's more interesting than what he said, which I think many free speech advocates and those that have been concerned about the decline of free speech in Europe and the UK specifically, they would probably agree with him. In a way, what's been more revealing and enlightening is the response. Basically saying that, his view of free speech opens up the gateways to, the rise of Nazism. And I'd point out to listeners and viewers the so-called Weimar fallacy, the idea that it was overly relaxed free speech laws in Germany in the 1920s and 30s that led to the rise of Nazism. No, a much more sophisticated view of that would show that it was the weaponization of hate speech laws, eventually when they came in, that provided such a useful tool for Hitler, and as indeed, think of what's the country that wanted hate speech laws introduced to the UN? Well, it was Russia, Soviet Union. So making criticism of the Soviet Union and its leadership effectively hate speech. But so look, I think he's onto something. If you take a long historical sort of civilizational view, yes, absolutely, he's onto something. Is it the most pressing thing in Europe and the UK right at the moment? Perhaps not. But he's certainly raising something that if you don't have a constant advocacy and energy put into maintaining free speech and its importance, it just tends to erode, just tends to decline. And by the time really difficult, wicked social problems on a national or even global scale arise, and you realise that you're being hamstrung in having the conversations you needed to have 10 or 20 years ago about those problems, to that extent, yes, I think he's right. So, and again, going back to that issue around hate speech and its application and the restriction on free speech, we just need to be very careful that there are trends emerging and downstream impacts which might be hard to see from where we are now, but if you take a longer historical view, and I think perhaps that's what Vance is talking to in the case of Europe, there are massive downstream implications for increased restrictions on free speech. And of course, the classic example of the restriction on free speech that has been so successful, that we've already talked about, is the characterisation of Islamophobia in the UK, led by Muslim advocacy groups precisely to protect their own bigoted and misogynist views from proper scrutiny. And that's a classic example of the argument against free speech and the argument for hate speech, and one of the outcomes of those kinds of debates. So to that extent, yes, I'd agree with him, but there's probably more obvious things to worry about. But he's quite right. If you're in an environment where very important policy matters of global or national significance can't be talked about, you will find all of these things happening downstream. And to that extent, I'd agree with him.
Yes, and I agree with what you said earlier, that when we have that kind of repressive environment, even now to the extent you mentioned the UK, push to basically reintroduce blasphemy laws through the back door. These are all coming from parts of political Islam as well. But we will then create a situation where the only people who will talk are the people we don't want talking, the people we don't want having carriage of these issues, because they're coming from a seriously toxic and perhaps racist place.
Or, yeah, exactly, yes. And so it's better that moderate, sensible and sensitive people to how speech can be, how speech can be nasty, how speech can be corrosive. There are bad things about speech. How speech can be hurtful indeed. But we need to understand that if majority of sensible people are too scared to speak, it will only leave the fringes talking, and it makes the return to a normalcy of expectations of civil dialogue, civil disagreement, and debating difficult topics practically impossible.
Well, I wish I could just put you in front of so many people, Alan, to spread this message about how we have to stop and we have to think very carefully about where we go from here and avoid just jumping towards, what looks like a silver bullet today, but tomorrow will turn out to be disastrous. So thank you so much, and good luck with the great work that you do, and I hope we can speak again soon.
Thanks, Julie. It's been great.